I would say the article, The Myth of the Culture of Poverty, and this chapter relate quite a bit just because it talks about how we need to treat all of our kids equally in our classroom. We can't have biases on any kids. We can't treat them differently just because we know that they live in a lower end area or have a lower income than some other students in our classroom. And so when I was going through the soft shock slides, it talked about the research on quality of interactions with students. And these really hit me because there are two of them that I notice I tend to do sometimes. And it kind of took me aback. I'm like, wow, I, first of all, I need to stop doing this. But it really gives you a whole new perspective um, of what you're doing when you're teaching, because sometimes you don't notice it while you're doing it, but after you like read about it and talk about it, then you're like, huh, I actually do that, and I shouldn't be doing that. So the 2 points that really hit me the most for the interactions with students was one, teachers wait time teachers wait less time for Lowe's to answer questions and call on Lowe's less frequently to answer questions. Sometimes I notice that I do wait a little less of time for Lowe's to answer questions because I'm trying to get my lesson moving. So then I tend to say, do you want me to call on somebody else? And then they're usually shaking their head. So then I call on somebody who does know the answer, which is not what I should do. I should continue to keep um, reinforcing this student who I called on originally and just trying to keep asking some questions, adding on to my original question to help them say the answer. I shouldn't just all of a sudden, oh, you don't know it, let's move to somebody else. And sometimes I do notice I do that just because I'm always worried about my time and my lesson. I'm trying to keep things moving. I don't want to just sit there and wait and wait and wait. But that is one thing I really, really need to work on. And then the other point that was teachers generally demand less from low achieving students. I noticed that I don't necessarily do this, but I notice myself thinking, I'm like when I'm making up a lesson for the next day or the few days ahead, I notice that I'm like, well, half these students aren't going to be able to do that, so we can't do this. But I shouldn't be thinking that negative thought. I should be like, well, how are we going to fix or how are we going to change the lesson so these students can do it? Like, how are we going to provide more resources so these students are able to do this lesson with our other kids that are higher up academically, not just immediately think, oh, they can't do it, so we got to do something else. And so that's sometimes I notice myself thinking of that, and I know that it's not how you should be thinking. Obviously, as a teacher, as an educator, you're supposed to be providing more resources for these lower end children, academic wise, to get them higher up in their academics and to help them, not just stay on their level, because you're trying to push them to succeed. And sometimes I notice myself thinking those kind of thoughts, and I just gotta get rid of those thoughts. And so in the article, there are two myths that really related in my classroom, and they were the poor people are unmotivated and have weak work ethics, and the other myth was poor parents are uninvolved in their children's learning largely because they do not value education. And at first, when I first came to the school I was in, I immediately thought these because I've never been in a low income school before. The school where I grew up in, my elementary school, I mean, I was in a small town school, but we didn't have like, I would say, poverty or like lower end income kids like we were all pretty much full middle class. Like, we had a lot of resources available to us, good family lives. But when I read these myths, I'm like, now that I think about it, and now that I'm in a school that is like a Title I school, a low area income school, I'm like, these children aren't unmotivated, or they're not lazy, and the parents they do value education, and maybe it seems like they don't, but it's because they're providing for their children, they're working multiple jobs, they're trying to do what is best for their children, and just to continue to provide for them so they can live a comfortable and healthy life. It's not just because they don't value education. They're really doing anything for their children to get a better education. So that's one thing that I need to just constantly remind myself if the parents aren't coming to conferences, or if they're not willing to talk on the phone. That's just one thing I need to always remind myself future wise, and as I become my own teacher in my own classroom, just to know that these parents are doing whatever it takes for their children to succeed in school, even if it may not seem like that, but they are.